Hey all, it's Ryder, and I hope you're trying to remain positive. As always, your writings in both the comment section and Discord server are a highlight of my day, so if you would like to add to the discussion, know that I read through all of them and respond to as many as I can. For those not in the community server, there is a link attached below. ESO is a game that can seem really confusing with equating one number to another to make any sort of comparison. And that's even before we get into how each statistic is calculated separately from one another. Today, we're going to focus on unique resource generation, its definitions and applications within the subclassing meta. As always, if you're enjoying the content, subscribing to the channel will allow more players to learn where gatekeeping has previously prevented them from participating in PvP. So I'd really appreciate it if you did. Use the timestamps and chapters to skip through the video at your leisure, as the video will follow the table of contents displayed on your screen. If you're brand new to PvP though, I recommend sticking through the entire video as I cover a lot of tools that you may not have considered before. There's 3 ways of restoring resources in ESO, that being recovery, heavy attacking, and unique resource return. While the first 2 concepts are well understood, let's first establish a definition to follow. I'm defining unique resource return as any skill, passive, or set that provides a numeric value of Magicka or stamina to the user. Most players will be familiar with any potion, as many of them act as sources of unique resource return with an attached recovery passive as well. When theory crafting your build, it's easy to focus only on the character sheet to identify strengths and weaknesses, but sustaining resources goes beyond what your recovery says. For example, if I'm making a tank that relies on blocking with 3000 stamina recovery, a new player may assume that they would never run out of block, but I'm sure many of you already rebutted this recovery stat is disabled when blocking. As such, and as with anything else in your build, context is paramount, and some builds benefit from the recovery stat more than others. To put plainly, you can have unlimited recovery and still struggle with sustain, and 0 recovery and be just fine. It's how the resource returns are implemented that matter the most. My intended learning outcome is to provide you with another path of sustain outside of the recovery statistic. While many players rave over high recoveries, there's many great builds out there who go another path. And with that, we'll begin with a list of active abilities that remain viable throughout Update 47. Dark Deal and Dark Conversion provide either Magicka or stamina over 10 seconds. While the skill line isn't desired by most, builds already incorporating the Dark Magic line can easily drop a lot of their recovery just for this skill, especially if Dark Deal is used on a range build where casting the ability is safer. Translating the 2400 resources over 10 seconds, we get an equivalent of 480 recovery. But here's where we have to pause. One distinction between unique resource return and recoveries is that while recoveries scale with passives, such as Animal Companion's Flourish passive, unique resources will not, thus displaying the pros and cons of each ability. Dark Deal will give stamina even when you're blocking or sprinting, allowing for more uses of these maneuvers. That said, if your build utilizes a recovery set like Wretched Vitality, stacking further into recovery would be more desirable, and the skill line could potentially be ignored. The same goes for most sets and abilities within this video, and important to note when you're trying to solve your sustain issue. Back to the skill though, Dark Deal is best used on either a ranged burst or a brawler build, as the cast time will either require high defensive to safely use, or the ability to streak away and break line of sight. On another note, if your build uses immovability potions, being crowd control immune would provide more windows of opportunity to use this skill. If you're currently using Assassination for Merciless Resolve but are having sustain issues, you could drop this skill line out for Crystal Frags and then use Dark Deal instead, but you will notice a bit of damage loss. Overall, Dark Deal and its morphs are really solid sustain option that also provides a burst heal if you're lacking one already. Siphoning Strikes is a favorite among many PvE tanks. With a cheap health cost to activate, the skill restores 2600 Magicka and stamina, as well as making your damage restore 200 of each resource per second. There's a lot to take in with the skill, but let's start by comparing Siphoning Strikes to Dark Deal. Siphoning Strikes consumes health instead of healing like Dark Deal does, however provides a bonus to Magicka and stamina. You can think of the relationship between the abilities as seen on your screen, where each skill has a negative to 1 resource and a positive to 2 others. If your build already has sufficient healing, Siphoning Strikes may be the better option for your build, but if you're lacking a burst heal, lean towards Dark Deal and its morphs. To continue the comparison, Darkdeal's condition for its resource over time restoration is easier to achieve than Siphoning Strike, that being just one activation of the ability, but Siphoning Strikes has other advantages. Whenever damage ticks, which will be nearly every second in PvP, you're restoring both resources and provide a small heal as well. Because we're in a hybrid meta where all three resources will be constantly used, Siphoning Strikes is arguably one of the best sustain skills in the game, and other passives from the line play into this choice more. For example, although Catalyst just received a nerf, this allows one to use their ultimates more often, benefiting from Earthen Heart's Battle Roar passive, but more on that later. The passive ability provides an equivalent of 400 Magicka and Stamina Recovery, slightly lower than Darkdeal if not actively used, but this value applies to both stats as well rather than just one. Employing Siphoning Strikes is simple, but knowing when to activate the skill is important. Essentially, because the ability has a health cost, you shouldn't use the skill during either your burst window or your enemy's burst window. In one of my previous videos, I used this graphic to demonstrate when heavy attacking is appropriate. With this in mind, we see heavy attacks being used between opportunities for one player to kill another, and you should treat the active effect of Siphoning Strikes in the same way as a heavy attack. To end out the comparisons between Siphoning Strikes and Darkdeal, here's an image displaying the pros and cons of each skill with considerations to their skill lines as well. Focus Rune and Restoring Focus provide Magicka or Stamina over time, as well as acting as Templar's Resolve ability. Let's first break down the ability in its components. First, the ability gives a healing over time, which greatly increases if stood within, and provides an important armor buff. Before we go further, if you're having sustain issues and would need to drop your current Resolve skill line anyway, Templar's Restoring Light solves both of these issues. To explain, the 242 returned resources per second is converted into a comparable 484 recovery, again, noting this is not true recovery. To determine if this ability is worth it for you, consider your archetype and playstyle. The more mobile your build is, the more you should stay away from Focus Rune. But if you're invested into playing like a brawler or any generalist build that would prefer standing their ground, Focus Rune will extend your offensive window and provide unique resource return, allowing for more frequent and longer periods of blocking while you attempt to flip to the offense. I have personally made a lot of great use of this in every PvP setting, and it has been one of my favorite skills since I started playing 10 years ago. There's an interesting relationship between Focus Rune and blocking, in that because the returned resources per second are so high, if one were to cut their block cost very low, this ability could be the sole support to one's stamina bar. Focus Rune differs from the previous two abilities in that, while Siphoning Strikes and Darkdeal's activations pose a small threat to the user, either through a health drain or a cast time, Focus Rune can be activated while blocking, not only at little expense, but more importantly, it actually minimizes the risk by placing an increased healing value immediately. Like I mentioned, Focus Rune is best used for builds foregoing mobility for higher mitigations. If you foresee yourself blocking in PvP more than dodging or kiting, absolutely consider this skill to be at the top of your list. Builds utilizing critical damage mostly already include Betty or Netch into their builds, and I won't go into a long ramble about this skill because of that. The skill line works similarly to Focus Rune, but is free, providing a cleanse, a small heal when used, and 173 Magicka or Stamina per second, generally equated to 353 recoveries. Interestingly enough, the skill line provides a 20% increased recovery passive as well, and while the Netch skill and the Flourish passive don't synergize with each other directly, they both lead you to the goal of sustaining more. This choice, however, cannot be made only based on the sustain provided by Netch, but by the win condition of your build as well. If your build goes for raw damage and you are lacking sustain, I advise avoiding the Animal Companions line, for the largest value this provides is its critical damage, a statistic that would be wasted if your critical values are low. The skill line shines the best in builds utilizing speed and sprinting often, especially if your build is not already including storm calling, jabs, or other sources of major brutality as well. Moreover, Netch has resource return, similar to all the prior abilities, but can be seen as almost an opposite of Focus Rune. Whereas Rune provides an armor buff with resources, Netch provides an offensive bonus with resources. This isn't to say they're mutually exclusive, but instead can actually synergize well together. To demonstrate, on my current build, I use both Restoring Light's Focus Rune and the Bold Netch, giving me just over 400 stamina per second. Even if I invested into just a bit of block reduction, I'm effectively unkillable in any 1v1 scenario, just because of these two abilities alone. Netch, while not explicitly powerful as some of the other options in terms of sustain, offers bonuses such as Major Brutality, a cleanse, and a small heal. It's a really solid choice that many newer players overlook, but veteran players understand its strength. While the other skills are really common, the last two on the list fly under the radar. Living Death's Expunge and Modify is the Necromancer Purge and returns up to 1,000 of each resource when two effects are removed. Unfortunately, the ability can't keep up with the other cleanses offered in the game, such as Netch and Extended Ritual, so most players forgo the skill line. That said, keep a lookout in future updates if this ability gets buffed. The skill line gives access to Spirit Mender, which grants a lot of damage reduction, and it can promote builds that suddenly become really difficult to kill. As of now, however, there isn't much else to say about this ability. If your opinion differs, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinion on this. While not the strongest option on the list by any means, I would be remiss not to include Recuperative Treatise for all the Arcanist enjoyers out there. In PvE, we use Inspired Scholarship, the other morph of this skill, but for PvP, try out Recuperative Treatise. The damage trade-off from this version and the other is noticeable, but so is the gain in sustain. The ability gives an equivalent 240 resources returned per 2 seconds, which isn't a lot, but considering this ability is already used in Arcanist builds utilizing Crux, this part isn't too important. Some players are able to make great use of the skill line in PvP, but I'm certainly not one of them. To this end, I can only iterate my observations and speculations on the skill's viability. Truthfully, because the ability is already part of a larger picture of achieving a win condition, such as the build using runes in Tentacular Dread or Flail with Beam, I think it's fine that this skill offers marginal resource return. Whereas Siphoning Strikes, for example, is seen as one of the best skills in the game for sustain, that's also the ability's sole purpose, and must be built around to support its power. Recuperative Treatise trades its power for the ease of its inclusion. There's definitely other abilities that provide a unique resource return, but I only wanted to include the ones that I thought to be viable, or at least worth consideration. If there's some I missed, or that you think are undervalued by the community, let us know. So placing all of the active skills together, we can piece together a bar graph that displays all of the overtime resource return effects. Note that the instant sustain granted by the activation of Dark Deal and Siphoning Strikes is not included, but you can see these as additional parts of the sustain item to replace a heavy attack. Before we take this graph as face value, however, it's important to note that if you were to take Betty Netch, you should also account for your base recoveries, as selecting the skill line will unlock the Flourish passive for 20% more recovery, adding a lot of additional value to this skill. Moreover, when selecting the appropriate resource return skill, you must consider both your playstyle and the skill line the ability comes from, as a perma-blocking tank should take skills other than Dark Deal, and a player relying on Streak wouldn't receive the most benefit from Focus Rune. Take this graph and all the previous information as choices to make for your build, rather than only going for the highest return possible. Moving on to the passives category, similarly to the active abilities, I'm only listing the ones I think to be relevant within update 46 and 47. There's far too many passives that may add a small amount of resource return that I haven't listed, but these are the ones I deem to be important. Starting with Battle Roar, this is an Earthen Heart passive, granting 37 of each resource with some additional healing. I recently collaborated with Juggy on his channel discussing the strength of the skill line, so if you're wanting a reason to play Dragonite, absolutely go check out his video and channel. He's becoming a good friend of the community. Back to it, understanding the value of Battle Roar requires a little bit of math, and we can use the formula on your screen to convert these resources per ultimate into resources per second. But this formula also requires us to understand how much ultimate we gain per second. If you're not already familiar with combat metrics, it's an add-on that tells you a lot of the fight stats. While the tool is pretty in-depth, we're only using the front page for this part, so it should be relatively easy to identify for everyone watching. If you're in Battlegrounds, duels, or are otherwise able to use both your front and back bar in PvP, look at your combat metrics report to determine how much ultimate you gain per second. And we can plug this number into the formula to determine your resources gained over time. On your screen, I've created a graph that shows how many resources per second you should receive at different ultimate gain values, with lower ultimate generating builds being on the left and high ultimate generating builds on the right. I'll note that users relying on Battle.org or Turn and Burn builds in general will not receive the same benefits from Battle Roar as builds relying on other monster sets or are otherwise rewarded for holding more ultimate beyond its cost, as the formula doesn't account for this. That's enough math for now though, and we can continue the discussion. The value of Battle Roar needs to consider how much ultimate you're producing, and if you're already using 2 other skill lines with a moderate degree of ultimate generation, and you're not a Turn and Burn build. Battle Roar can be an excellent sustaining tool that is otherwise overlooked by many players. Combustion, Rebate, Helping Hands, and Nature's Gift, while not being identical, operate in similar ways as they're all passives that require skill to activate. And on paper, you have many choices within the skill line to meet this condition, but with bar space being so tight, players traditionally activate using just a handful of skills. So the comparisons made will be in relation to their ability timers rather than every skill within the line. As such, I'll discuss all of their values at the end of this section. Starting with Combustion from Ardent Flame, this is the most relaxed passive and can activate from your enchantments as well as many of the Ardent Flame skills, and you won't find yourself forcefully activating this, but it'll be a part of your kit. In PvP, you can easily keep up 100% uptime on this if using Charged, but in practice, the values will be a bit less. Rebate from Daedric Summoning was able to be activated more previous to the release of Subclassing, given damage shields were used among all sorcs. But within the current patch, I don't see many players using this outside the Sorcerer connoisseur, Hey Jensen. The original writing on this part was much longer, but the returns from this aren't much at all, so we'll move on. Helping Hands, as explained in Juggy's video, like and subscribe to him by the way, is middling, but helps a little bit. By no means the strongest option on the list, but because it also comes from Earthen Heart, it's worth mentioning. Nature's Gift is the final passive in the grouping. It is actually really quite strong. While I mostly only cover generalist builds on my channel, the passive is strong enough to warrant me deviating from this pattern. Without even thinking, you can reach 100% uptime on this passive, returning 277 of either resource per second. And if your healer build has high mitigations with block cost reductions, meaning dying is exceptionally difficult, this is especially true when paired with a maturation passive from the same line. So, putting all of them together and examining their values based upon ideal ability activation, we can see that the passives are simply okay at returning resources over time, with the exception of Nature's Gift being well above the rest. I didn't want to spend a lot of time in this section, but I would be omitting vital information if I simply chose to ignore it. There's also other passives from other lines as well, but honestly, they all basically present the same result. For the Constitution Heavy Armor passive, I've created a graph that places the number of pieces worn against the resources returned per second. This can actually add up to quite a bit, especially when used with other forms of unique resource return, such as any of the active abilities mentioned. Most builds will use 3 or 4 pieces of heavy gear, so expect around 100 resources returned per second with this passive, assuming you're staying within combat. This obviously benefits brawlers and frontline builds more than ranged builds, but this is intuitive to most parts of building process anyway. One of my previously favorite weapons in ESO, the Restoration Staff, saw a decline in use since the high damage meta took place. If you're unfamiliar as to why, I've discussed that higher damage means more effective maximum hit points is important in some of my other videos, and ice staves or a sword and shield backbar are really important right now. Nonetheless, if we see a drop off in damage, or if your build can actually use a Restoration Staff well, then let's continue the conversation. When blocking with a Restoration Staff, you'll recover 600 Magicka, and this can happen 4 times per second, which against a single attacker, which will only be once or twice depending on their sets and if they're using light attack weaving capability. But even so, stamina builds who otherwise have issues sustaining Magicka, specifically, can really benefit from this passive if they're running sets or abilities that provide high amounts of mitigation to make up for the defensive deficit created by running a Restoration Staff. Moreover, while discussing this, the heavy attack passive from this line is also really strong, acting as a burst of Magicka return, rather than over time like other abilities and passives listed in this video. When facing against multiple attackers, the value of the passive goes a bit gray. On one hand, you're able to return a lot of Magicka while blocking, allowing for continued uses of burst heals, but unfortunately, because you're blocking on a Restoration Staff and on an Ice Staff, you're actually going to be needing to heal a lot more, and you can lock yourself into a defensive feedback loop. If not carefully implemented, the Restoration Staff block could work against you. But like I said, if you're already using a high damage mitigation, this is a really strong tool. To group up the last bit of passives, we'll put Minor Magicka Steal and Absorb Magicka and Stamina Glyphs into this category. If you're constantly dealing damage to an enemy through dots, Minor Magicka Steal will return 168 resources per second, which is okay and should be considered by dot builds. The Absorb enchants, however, are much more appealing. Enchantments have a 4-second cooldown by default in ESO, but the Infuse trait can have this, so because of this, we can determine the value of these enchantments in this scenario, where a weapon ability would constantly activate them. On your screen, I've attached the values of 3 scenarios: a 2-handed weapon without infused, a 1-handed weapon without infused, and a 2-handed weapon with infused. While not providing the highest damage possible, we should also consider that the additional damage or sustain provided by either Absorb Magicka and Stamina. Starting with Absorb Magicka, we can reliably activate Minor Magicka Steal through the Overcharged condition, adding an additional 168 resource return, and for Absorb Stamina, we can activate the Sunder stats effect, granting us weapon damage and minor breach to the enemy. Just like all things in ESO, many of the tools have separate, sometimes implicit uses, and this is seen through the absorption glyphs. If you're a Magicka-based ranged build using Force Pulse, an Absorb Magicka glyph presents many resources over time, but this isn't actually as strong as sustain options in most cases. And to explain, let's revisit the concepts covered at the beginning of the video. Unique resource return is strongest when used in builds that rely on maneuvers such as sprinting or blocking, when recoveries are disabled so that you can continue to fuel these maneuvers. While the Absorb Magicka and Stamina glyphs are strong on their own, they don't scale with recovery passives and buffs, and these resources would only realistically be returned during your offensive window, so it's often better to go with a damaging glyph instead to assert more pressure. That said, this is not to say these glyphs are bad, not by any means, but they benefit in non-CP environments where damage is less necessary and resource sustain is paramount. To basically summarize this point, if you're struggling sustaining in battlegrounds and you use a weapon skill or are good about using your light attacks, try to go for an Absorb resource glyph instead of something like Flame or Poison. They have a ton of great value if your build can fit them in, and I personally run an Absorb Stamina glyph for just a bit of extra bonus on top of my high sustain. The final part of the video, we'll discuss both the Maelstrom Restoration Staff and Poisons. While there are a lot of sets in the game that provide a unique resource return, I'm hard-pressed to find a use for many of them within the current landscape, and discussing sets can quickly turn this into an hour-long video. If you're curious about a particular set, simply divide the resources gained by the cooldown and you can generally equate this to your non-buff resource recovery, and remember that this is best used on builds that disable recoveries, such as blocking builds. Back to it, the Maelstrom Restoration Staff is actually an amazing arena weapon that unfortunately saw its death at the hands of the Mythic setup meta. If using Radiant Regeneration and in any team fight, you'll have almost no problem sustaining, even on brawler builds, and especially so if using the aforementioned staff passives as well. It obviously requires an ability slot to use, but honestly, if you already have high defensives, this is a really strong team play item, as it keeps your allies in the fight longer while keeping your resources topped off really high. Unfortunately, I can't currently recommend this item, but know that this exists for future patches if the time to kill increases. For poisons, there's a few variants that offer more or less resource siphon, as seen on your screen. Because these can become costly and my videos are for the average PvP player, I won't go into a lot of detail about these poisons. They're certainly really strong though, and if you can continuously activate them, they can easily not only carry your sustain, but force your opponent into heavy attacking, given you're increasing the cost of their abilities by a substantial amount. This in turn lessens the cost of your abilities, provided you're on the defensive less often. There's so much more I want to say, but this video is long enough as is. I highly encourage everyone here to explore all that ESO has to offer within this field, as making a build viable goes far beyond the stat sheet and should account for your playstyle above all else. If you're someone who enjoys using builds posted online, I highly encourage you to instead try your hand at the experience and consider some of the options listed today. Not every strong build will have insane stats to post on a thumbnail, but there's a lot of power that players often overlook based on how the PvP culture has progressed over the years. As always, thank you for watching, and if you made it this far, I applaud you for your attention span. If you did, leave some random comment just to throw off people who didn't make it to the end. You are all truly amazing, and remember to stay positive. I admit that even at times I struggle with this, but having a good system of friends to point you in the right direction helps a lot.